Hello and welcome to The Take with Sophy Ridge, live at 9 here in the heart of Westminster. Now, the Prime Minister is on his way to the G7 in Japan, and Rishi Sunak is a man who needs to leverage all of the power of the international stage to handle what's going on back home. Because after those local election results, Labour is a party with a spring in its step and a confidence that's allowing Keir Starmer to be bolder on housing and on Brexit than has been before. Along with the politics, we will also have the very latest on the car chase involving Prince Harry and Meghan as we bring you takes from all sides over the next 60 minutes.
After 13 years of Tory rule, they're still lurching from crisis to crisis and wallowing in their own mess. They can't solve the crisis because they are the crisis.
Well, with the PM in the air, it was the battle of the deputies at Prime Minister's Questions. Angela Rayner there, and she was up against Oliver Dowden, the third Deputy Prime Minister she's faced, that man there.
This comprehensive schoolboy is not going to take any lectures from the party opposite about the lives of working people.
Meanwhile, we finally got the long-awaited plans to reform the rental market in the UK.
Now we're making sure that there are more people in the private rented sector who have the security of knowing that they cannot be evicted from their home.
Well, we'll discuss whether those reforms go far enough. Plus, we'll talk about British support to Ukraine and much more with some great guests on the show this evening. First of all, we're going to be hearing from the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey. For Labour, we'll be speaking to the Shadow Schools Minister, Stephen Morgan. And we'll look much more closely at those reforms to the UK's rental market with a housing activist, Kwajo Tweneboa, and much more besides, coming up on The Take. Hello, good evening. Well, as we start the programme this evening, I just want to bring you up to date on the big breaking story that we've been covering on Sky News throughout today. Prince Harry and his wife Meghan, they have been involved in what Harry's spokesperson called a near-catastrophic car chase involving paparazzi. Well, the couple say they were chased through New York for 2 hours last night, although the city's mayor said he thought it was hard to believe that the incident had lasted longer than 10 minutes. We can have a little look now in a statement that the spokesperson from Prince Harry and Meghan have put out. They said that last night the Duke and Duchess of Sussex and Miss Ragland, which is Meghan's mother, were involved in a near-catastrophic car chase at the hands of a ring of highly aggressive paparazzi. This relentless pursuit, lasting over 2 hours, resulted in multiple near collisions involving other drivers on the road, pedestrians and 2 NYPD officers. While being a public figure comes with a level of interests from the public, it should never come at the cost of anyone's safety. Dissemination of these images, given the ways in which they were obtained, encourages a highly intrusive practice that is dangerous to all involved. Now, the couple were in the city for a charity event, a warning that there are some flashing images in the footage that we're about to show. Well, the chase began after Harry and Meghan left the Foundation for Women Awards ceremony, and this was actually their first public appearance together since the King's coronation. New York police who were accompanying the couple's vehicle say the incident was chaotic. The city's mayor spoke at a press conference this afternoon.
The press, paparazzis, they want to get the right shot, they want to get the right story. But public safety must always be at the forefront. The briefing I received, 2 of our officers could have been injured. New York City is different from a small town somewhere. You shouldn't be speeding anywhere, but this is a densely populated city. And I think all of us, I don't think there's many of us who don't recall how his mom died. And it would be horrific to lose an innocent bystander during a chase like this and something to have happened to them as well. I would find it hard to believe that there was a 2-hour high-speed chase. That would be, I find it hard to believe, but we will find out the exact duration of it. But if it's 10 minutes, a 10-minute chase is extremely dangerous in New York City. We have a lot of traffic, a lot of movement, a lot of people are using our streets. Any type of high-speed chase that involves something of that nature is inappropriate.
Dangerous, inappropriate, the city's mayor commenting there. In the last few moments, we've also had these words from Ashley Hanson, who is the press secretary to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. He said, "I've never experienced their vulnerability as much as I did last night. They were incredibly scared and shaken up. There were several times where the car stopped and security got out. There were instances where the police confronted the paparazzi and had asked them to stop or give them space to do this safely. Unfortunately, that wish was not respected." Well, let's bring in our US correspondent, James Matthews. James, what is the latest?
Hi, Sophie. Yeah, well, what we have essentially are two versions of the same story, and certainly two versions of the amount of risk that was involved in developments last night. It was clearly an ugly episode, ugly from the perspective of Harry and Meghan. You heard that statement there from their press secretary. They were pursued for some considerable distance, and according to a statement from their spokespeople, this lasted for 2 hours and more. It's clear that the bulk of that time was taken up with Harry and Meghan trying to shake off paparazzi. They had been at this event organised by the Ms. Foundation for Women of Vision. Meghan was being celebrated for her contribution to gender equality and for human rights. It was when they left that there were clearly photographers jostling for a picture. They tailed their SUV vehicle. It drove around the streets of Manhattan at that time of night, still relatively crowded, for an hour and 15 minutes. When they realised they couldn't shake off the photographers, they headed for a police station. And it was in that police station, having been escorted by an NYPD police vehicle, that they spent around 15 minutes, we understand, and were switched into a vehicle, at least one vehicle, and at least one taxi at some point. It may be that they made several trips from that police station, because one taxi driver speaks of them getting in the back of his cab. He says that he drove for around 10 minutes from that police station, and there were indeed photographers. The security guard was unsettled by their presence, and within 10 minutes said, "Take us back to the police station." They did make an onward journey eventually from that station to the private residence of a friend, which is where they were trying to get to and trying to shake off photographers so they wouldn't find out where they were. But that taxi driver, for that 10-minute journey, he says this was nothing like a car chase at that point. He says they seemed unsettled. It's no surprise to him that there had been unsettling events before they got in to the cab, but he never felt in any danger. Indeed, he says that photographers kept a reasonable distance behind them, but he does say that when the vehicle stopped, photographers took pictures in the windows. It's clearly a distressing episode for Harry, given his personal experience, Sophie. I was at Balmoral in 1997, the day after his mother was killed in that Paris car crash. I remember the 12-year-old Harry, ashen-faced, alongside his brother William, looking at floral tributes to his mother. And he clearly blames the media for her death and resents the media for their intrusion into her life and into his. I think we have two stories here, one being told by Harry and Meghan of photographers driving on pavements, breaking red lights, going the wrong way up one-way streets and generally endangering their lives. But we have the New York story, backed up by NYPD, and the mayor spoke to it as well. They are stopping well short of describing anything as near catastrophic. Indeed, these law enforcement officials say, yes, there were chaotic scenes. The NYPD says it was a traffic challenge. They call it challenging, but on the business of it being near catastrophic, that's where they part with Harry and Meghan.
Thanks very much, James. And also that image, of course, of little Harry in 1997, one that I think I can understand why it stayed with you. Thank you very much for bringing us the context of that story. We'll, of course, bring more updates to you on that breaking news story as they come in. In the meantime, though, back to our political interviews, because I did speak to the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, a little earlier. And before moving on to the wider political agenda today, I started our interview by asking for his reaction to the news about Harry and Meghan.
Well, I mean, lots of sympathy for the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk and Mrs. Markle. I given what happened to the Duke of Sussex's mother, I can only imagine how harrowing it must have been for him. And, I only know that as much as I've seen in the sort of breaking news in the afternoon, but I can imagine for him and his family, it must have been very harrowing indeed. I'm sorry to hear that it happened.
The Prince's taxpayer-funded protection was removed when he stepped back as a senior royal and left the UK to go to the United States. Is that the kind of thing that maybe should be re-looked at, given what's happened?
Oh, look, I think, Sophie, impossible to offer that sort of reaction on the fly when all I've done is seen the breaking news. I think it's appropriate to offer my sympathies and to say how awful it must have been. But without knowing any of the circumstances, impossible to comment on behalf of the government about what the security implications may be.
OK, understood. As you say, a fast-moving story. We'll be following lots of developments on that, of course. The Defence Secretary is in Germany and discussing continued support for Ukraine. What are the kinds of things that we're looking at?
Well, I mean, he is in Germany to discuss many things, not least the future of NATO. There's an important conference coming up in a month or so's time. But any conversation on Euro-Atlantic security clearly revolves around what's going on in Ukraine. There is a donor community, the UK and Germany, both very prominent within it, that are giving enormous amounts of kit to the Ukrainians. And Ben and Minister Pistorius will have been having discussions about what that looks like as the offensive goes on this summer. And obviously, you've seen from Ben's comments that long-range weapons, the artillery ammunition and air defence systems, and of course fighter jets are very much the live conversation.
What is the live conversation when it comes to fighter jets then?
Well, I think the conclusion that the Ukrainians have come to is that they would very much like to operate F-16, and there are a number of nations that operate F-16 that have indicated a willingness in principle to provide them. The UK doesn't operate F-16, and so what we've said is that we will assist in the pilot training pipeline to help pilots to learn to fly in the first place, and then of course countries that operate F-16 will need to do the special to type training thereafter. And although we don't have any of those jets to donate ourselves, there are clearly things that we can support the countries that do donate those jets, either through providing some Royal Air Force capability to backfill any lost capability on their part, or to support the maintenance and arming of those jets once donated.
You talked there about the enormous support that the UK has offered to Ukraine. Your new procurement minister said today the refresh of the MOD's defence review, so the Defence Command paper, should be released by the end of June. Are there going to be cuts to personnel or equipment in order to balance the books?
Well, look, the process of looking at the future of our armed forces, making sure that we have properly learnt the lessons from Ukraine, that all of the innovation that we've assisted the Ukrainians in making with their forces and that have had such effect in the fight in Ukraine are quickly absorbed into the UK armed forces as well. So it'd be premature, in fact, until the data publication, it would be completely wrong to say what those conclusions exactly are. But I suspect that your viewers, whatever their concern may be about the shape, size of the Army, Navy, Air Force, would agree that it is entirely incumbent on us to, A, make sure that everything that we've learned from Ukraine is reflected as quickly as possible in our own armed forces, and that, B, we recognise that since we published the last Defence Command paper, the world has become ever more insecure and ever more unstable, and so we need to make sure that we are gearing ourselves against all of those threats, and that's exactly what we're doing in the work we've got going on the command paper refresh at the moment.
So just stripping away what you're talking about, you're not ruling out cuts then, are you?
No, I mean, I'm not ruling cuts out, I'm not ruling increases out. I'm saying that we are on a technology threshold at the moment. There is lots of amazing things coming into use in all sectors of the economy with automation and artificial intelligence.
Okay.
Computing power is improving exponentially, which means the ability to sort of crunch data and thus to target more effectively means that something that might previously have taken 10 artillery guns and 100 rounds might in the future be achieved by a couple of guns with 20 rounds. That's the order of magnitude of change that might be possible. And what we're doing in the MOD with the brilliant scientists that we've got in the Defence Science and Technology laboratories and with our brilliant people in defence intelligence is to try to understand all of those emerging technologies as much as we can, see how they've been employed in Ukraine and apply those to our force.
A big part of the things that you're looking at. Rishi Sunak is on his way to the G7 in Japan. How helpful do you think it is that his predecessor, Liz Truss, is at the very same time giving a speech in Taiwan, making comments about his foreign policy approach?
Well, Liz is now a backbencher, and as a parliamentarian, she is entirely in her rights to speak. And I think it is, when we're faced with the autocratic oppression that we see from Putin, the idea that a government minister should try and say that this particular member of parliament shouldn't be travelling and saying what is on her mind is clearly not the way we do business in this democracy. The Prime Minister will go to the G7 and speak for the nation. Liz is in Taiwan reflecting her personal view.
Understood. And there's a couple of domestic issues that I'll be keen to get your view on as well, and talk about the big changes that you've made to the rental market today. We'll be talking to a housing campaigner, Kwajo, later on the programme, and he made quite a good point, I thought that I would steal and put to you. He said local authorities have had their funding slashed over the last 13 years. Look at the state of social housing. They are now under pressure to enforce this bill and monitor landlords. Will they be given the funding needed to do this? What's your answer to that?
Well, I can't give you the answer that the housing minister would give you. I can give you a pretty good answer about the impacts of quantum computing on the modern battle space, but the exact detail of deluxe policy, I can't. What I can say...
It's not huge... look, I'm not expecting you to know every single dotted I and crossed T in the housing policy, but I think it is a fair question to say, look, if you actually want this to work, you're going to need local authorities to be funded properly to do it, right?
Well, before you come in, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I think that obviously when you bring in any sort of reform like this, you want to consult widely and make sure that it is going to work. This, as I understand it, is a proposal that has indeed taken some time to develop. And so I would expect that the point that your contributor makes is either one that has already been considered in the development of the policy or is something that the department will be keen to engage with to make sure that it is going to work for local authorities in the way that he suggests it may not.
OK, understood. And then just finally, there has been a lot of speculation that net migration could hit as high as 1 million next week. This is legal immigration, of course, important to make that distinction. Given that it's legal, should we be relaxed about how high that number goes?
Well, look, I think that there has been a lot of effort in government to make sure we shut down on illegal migration. That is the bit that I think the public react to as being unfair, inappropriate, and it's right that they expect their government to control their borders. As for what our requirements are when it comes to legal migration, I think there are lots of economic arguments for why we do need workforce to meet the needs of certain sectors. But clearly, we have to also make sure that we are not missing the opportunity to improve our productivity and drive innovation into our workplace by taking advantage of cheap migrant labour. Now, my sense is from what I've seen of the debate playing out within government that that is very much the balance that the government is trying to strike. I think it's invidious to say that a certain number is too much or that there should be a ceiling or that we should be aiming for a target that is significantly lower. We should do what is needed for our economy, whilst recognising that the answer to a labour shortage isn't always more migration, actually focusing on issues of productivity and automation and technology in the workplace is similarly important.
Really good to talk to you. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I thought that final answer on the debate about migration really interesting, actually. Clearly, a live debate going on, as James Heappey acknowledges, within government about those upcoming net migration figures expected to be pretty high. It'll be interesting to see what the actual response is when they do come out. You're watching The Take. We're live here in Westminster for you. Up next, we're going to get Labour's view with the Shadow Schools Minister.
We are part of a unified effort with our European allies to show our strong support for Ukraine, but also to condemn Russia in as loud and as strong a voice as we can. And the U.S. is very much a part of that, and we support the efforts of our European colleagues and want to make sure that Ukraine knows it has our support. We have seen the destruction that Russia has wrought on the Ukrainian people. We see the missiles every day bombing buildings and bombing their infrastructure, and they have to be held accountable for that. And the registry is one step toward laying that foundation of accountability so that in the future we have the mechanism, we have the legal basis for holding Russia accountable. Well, of course, they're not going to recognize it. They don't recognize that they are committing acts of, they're committing war crimes. They're committing human rights violations. What they are doing is unconscionable, and we have to start the process of holding them accountable and have them, in particular with this registry, be called to the mat to pay for the damages that they have caused. We have worked with our colleagues, both at the UN and here in Europe, to find a basis that is supported by the majority. And we're here, and we are speaking with one voice, and we know that Ukraine appreciates that, and we know that Russia hears us.
Hello, welcome back live to Westminster. You're watching The Take, and it's been another packed day in Westminster. We've had the long-awaited rental reform proposals from the government, the kind of thing that really impacts people's lives, and the battle of the deputies at PMQs, plus much more just besides in the last couple of days. Let's take a quick look back, shall we, at some of the highlights of the political week so far.
Ukraine's President Zelensky's paid a surprise visit to the UK, meeting Prime Minister Rishi Sunak at his country residence Chequers.
It's been really good for us to have the time to talk together in private about the support that the UK is giving.
To create this just coalition, and I'm very positive with it.
Just want to bring you some video we have from Westminster. This took place at the National Conservatism Conference, which kicked off today.
I would like to draw your attention 2, a few characteristics of fascism.
Well, thank you very much.
Talking at the RCN's annual conference, Pat Cullen warned that nurses' strikes could go on until Christmas.
Prime Minister, you did the right thing to open negotiations with me in February. Before the 75th birthday of the NHS this July, let's get the job finished.
Important to stress just how rare these Council of Europe summits are. This is the first time this has happened in more than a decade, in 15 years. It's only happened 4 times since this group was set up after the Second World War.
We must also learn the lessons of this war by being prepared to confront threats to our societies before they become too big to deal with. That includes acting on cybersecurity and AI. And it means tackling illegal migration.
It's a pleasure to welcome yet another Deputy Prime Minister to the dispatch box, the 3rd deputy that I've faced in 3 years. And you know what they say, the 3rd time's a charm. And I'm also pleased to note, Mr Speaker, that the Prime Minister has a working class friend, finally.
It really is a pleasure to see the Right Honourable Lady here today. I was, though, expecting to face the Labour leader's choice for the next Deputy Prime Minister if they win the election. So I'm surprised that the Lib Dem leader isn't taking questions today.
They were enjoying that, weren't they? Let's get the view from Labour now, shall we? I'm joined live by the party's Shadow Schools Minister, Stephen Morgan. First time on the programme. Good to have you here. Thank you for coming in. It looked like they had a bit of a laugh at Deputy Prime Minister's questions. What do you think from the room?
They did. It was a bit spikier compared with usual, but I think Angela Rayner always does a brilliant job speaking up for our country.
Now, I want to talk to you about housing policy, because this really feels to me like it's gearing out to be one of the big battlegrounds for the next election. Labour is quite controversially saying it could build on the Green Belt. Can you just explain what that means? What is the Green Belt for our viewers who might not understand?
Well, I think it'd be fair to say that we've got a housing crisis in our country, and it absolutely is an important issue that I hear on the doorstep all the time. In my own constituency, 2,000 people are waiting on the council's waiting list for a home. The government target used to be for 17,500 more homes in Portsmouth, in a really densely populated city. What Keir set out today, I think, is our intentions to say a lot more on this in future, that we need to make some tough choices about reforming the planning system and making sure we build the homes that our country needs. And I think that's the right approach. And as he said, he could be on the side of businesses and on the side of builders, not on the side of blockers.
The question was about the Green Belt, though, right? The kind of buffer, if you like, between the countryside and urban areas that many people think is quite important to stop, an urban sprawl. Keir Starmer told me recently that he would take on the NIMBYs. But is that a bit dismissive of some people who might have genuine concerns about their local area?
Well, it's really important that people have their say, and communities are absolutely instrumental in that, and that's why we've got our Take Back Control bill that Lisa Nandy's been setting out, and she's been engaging with communities up and down the country. But we've got to find ways of building homes in our country. It's desperately needed. The way that we live is changing, and I think we've got to make sure that local authorities and communities have their say in these important decisions.
You say communities have their say, but, that's not completely what you're saying, is it? You're saying that actually, look, it's important to build homes just even on areas like the Green Belt.
Well, what I know about some of the consultation around home building is that sometimes the communities get involved too late in the day, and actually we need to bring forward the ways that communities have their say much earlier on.
OK. Now, teachers are striking. I'm going to ask you what Labour would do, but can I just ban the phrase that you want to get around the table? Because I feel like that's a given, right? We know you want to get around the table. I want to know what you're going to say when you get around the table. So teachers have turned down a 4.3% pay rise. What would Labour do?
Well, the first thing to say is that teachers are overworked, they're under huge stress, and I think they're undervalued. And I think the government have not done enough to negotiate a deal. I won't say it, but we certainly do want to see
Don't say it. Come on.
A fair deal for
What is
teachers.
a fair deal, then? What is a fair deal?
Well, it's really difficult.
Everyone wants to see a fair deal, but everyone has different definitions of what a fair deal is, right?
Really difficult for us to say. When we're not in government, we don't have the information available to us. But we've got to listen and engage to teachers. They do tremendous work.
You want to get around the table, I've got it, but what do you want to do? What do you want to do?
What keeps me awake at night, Sophie, is the fact that so many teachers are leaving the profession. They've joined the profession, they've got the chance to transform children's lives, but within a few years they leave because they're demoralised, the workload is too great. Pay is really important. There are other things as well, and that's why I'm talking to teachers on a regular basis to find out what they'd want to see from an incoming Labour government, and that's my priority.
I mean, I think what a lot of teachers would like to see is more pay, right? So what would Labour give them more pay?
Well, look at what we did in government last time round. We transformed our nation's schools, and pay rose by 19% under the last Labour government. We completely professionalised the teaching profession, and people joined that job. It was a brilliant job for people to do. We want to recruit more teachers, so I'm absolutely committed to talking to trade unions, to teachers and others. I was in a school this morning hearing what their concerns are, and I think more flexible working is one of the answers to their problems that they face.
I read an interview with Rachel Reeves recently where she was talking about how she wouldn't send her children to private school because she was saying that she wants them to see the world as it is. What's your view on private education?
I want to see every child in every part of our country going to a brilliant local school.
Of course, that's a given, right? But what is your view on private education?
Well, we've been really clear that we need to make some tough choices about how schools are funded, and we think it's only fair that we end the tax breaks that private schools enjoy. That would generate £2.2 billion that would go into the state sector and would do some really transformative things to improve outcomes for all young people.
Do you think that people who go to private school don't see the world as it is?
I think that parents make the choice that they think is best for their child. It wouldn't be a choice that I would make, but ultimately that's a choice that some parents do choose to make.
Now, I just want to talk to you a bit about Brexit, because it seems to me that Keir Starmer's been pretty punchy about Brexit today. I said breakfast there. That's such a classic Brexit slip of the tongue there. So to my colleague Ian King, for example, he said he would be open to renegotiation. There's lots of things that he wants to do, including closer trading. So would Labour see a much closer relationship with the EU than the current government then?
Well, I was a Remainer. I didn't want to see Brexit happen, but I accepted the outcome of the referendum, wanted to put that back to the people, but lost that argument at the last general election. What Keir set out is obviously a 5-point plan that we want to break down the barriers for trade. We want as close as possible relationship with the EU. I think that's the right approach. We need to move on. We need to make Brexit work, to smooth over the edges and get the best for our country.
You've ruled out rejoin the EU. You said there that you lost the argument at the last election to have another referendum. You've also ruled out rejoining the single market. I just wonder about the customs union, because it strikes me that, look, the big issue that some would say with the customs union is you can't strike your own trade deals. But, you know, would you say that the trade deals that we have managed to get with other countries have outweighed that we could have as part of the customs union?
Well, I think what we're seeing with some of the trade deals is there's not much detail there at all, and that's why, you know, we want to see a Labour government to have a close possible relationship with the European Union.
Do you think we could be looking at the customs union under a Labour government?
Well, we're really clear that we want to see a much closer relationship with Europe. We've set out a lot more detail on our policies ahead of the next election.
What about the customs union? I know I'm asking you to make, you know, you don't want to give...
It's not my brief, of course.
Yeah.
What I want to do is to make sure we hold the current government to account for their failings on Brexit, and we get the best possible deal for our economy and create the jobs that our country so desperately needs.
OK, thank you very much. It's great to have you on the programme today. Thank you. Thank you. So there you go. That was Labour's take. We can have a little chat now to our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who is standing by for us at the wall. Sam, I know your ears were kind of pricking up a little bit, weren't they, about what Keir Starmer was saying on Brexit. What's your sort of take on that?
That's right. You had Keir Starmer speaking to Ian King earlier. He talked about breaking down barriers, about negotiating real improvements with our relationship with the EU. Now, in part, this is simply a sign of Labour's confidence in politics at the moment, because for many, many months, actually, the Labour Party wasn't terribly keen to talk about the relationship with the EU for fear of kind of reviving some of the old arguments that hurt them at the last election. And I think right now, actually, you're seeing a reinvigorated Labour Party back up, going up again in the polls, feeling like it can talk about this stuff. So I think that's the first important thing. Now, in the past, they've been worried about the Tories' response, and the Tories have come out and said that the Labour Party want to rig British elections by allowing EU citizens to vote, reopen the Brexit deal, hand power to Brussels and surrender uncontrolled, unlimited immigration. That's the row that you're hearing. Almost all of that is untrue. The Labour Party have walked back from the idea of getting EU nationals to vote, say that they don't want unlimited, uncontrolled immigration, and all parties want to renegotiate Brexit because that's in the legislation. That's happening anyway in 2025-26.
So my question is, do you think that Labour are going a bit further, as you say, than they would have on Brexit because they're more confident that they can say what they thought all along, or because they are actually sensing that something is shifting when it comes to Brexit and the public view on it?
I think that you're hearing the arguments about Brexit that little bit louder. What you're hearing from Keir Starmer today, in technical terms, was in a speech by David Lammy a few months ago, but you didn't hear it amplified by the party. It's the confidence that means that's happening now loudly and in public. And it is going to mean, if this man's in Downing Street, a close relationship with Europe. He wants to do a kind of deal with the EU on kind of food and agriculture standards, which will stuff trade deals, frankly. He wants to do specific deals on specific sectors like cars. Now, the problem that he's got is that this man wants the good bits of the EU, some of the zero tariff agreements, the fact you don't have to pay when you transfer goods and it's easy to do, without some of the commitments, the need for freedom of movement, for instance, which Keir Starmer has ruled out. That is cherry picking. So the danger for Labour is if they get into power, they may have aspirations for a closer deal, but they'll find themselves with the problems that Britain has had all the way along since Brexit, which is you can't have the good bits and not have the obligations.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we always talk about EU and Labour's issues with the EU on the domestic audience, right? You know, how's it going to go down in the red wall? But actually, as you say, it could be the row with Brussels that is even more important if he is in number 10. Thanks very much for your analysis. We'll have more from Sam later in the programme. In the meantime, we are live in Westminster for you this evening. Up next, we're going to be taking a closer look at those all-important reforms to the rental market. Hello, welcome back live to Westminster. You're watching The Take. Well, let's turn back now to a story that we have been discussing a bit throughout the programme, and it's plans to scrap so-called no-fault evictions in England. They've been unveiled today as part of a long-promised shake-up of the rental market. Well, housing campaigners say the government's renters reform bill is a huge opportunity to improve the lives of millions of tenants. Our political correspondent Liz Bates reports.
For England's 11 million renters, life can be difficult.
I've been forced to move 3 times since the start of the pandemic through a combination of no-fault evictions, so like Section 21s, and rent rises.
Now, a change in the law is coming that the government says will help people like Jasmine by ending no-fault evictions.
I feel like more needs to be done. I feel like the bill doesn't go far enough. I say that because the way that I've been forced out each time is it may have come with a Section 21 notice, but in the end, you know, I've been advised there's no point in fighting your Section 21 notice if you can't afford to pay the rent increase.
Housing Secretary Michael Gove has insisted he is on the side of renters, and the plans will give more powers to people like Belinda, who says her landlord has repeatedly refused to fix mould and leaks and threatened her with eviction.
The good news is that even at a time when people are facing real pressure on their household budgets, that rents in the private rented sector have risen less than inflation. And of course, in this legislation, we affirm that rents can only rise once a year. And if rents are thought to be unfair, there's an ombudsman now that we're creating.
The bill will also give landlords new powers to evict tenants that are antisocial or behind on their rent. It will bring in new standards that force landlords to keep their properties safe and well maintained, and it will end blanket bans on people on benefits or with children. But some critics, including Conservative MPs, say it will drive landlords out of the sector.
He was given 2 keys, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 front door keys.
Lisa has experienced a problem tenant and has used a no-fault eviction.
When he didn't pay his rent, I issued the Section 21, which I'm very glad I did, but he didn't go out on the date he was. He lived there rent-free for 6 months.
But when she found out this law change was coming, she felt she had no choice but to sell.
It really does force your hand, and I decided to sell. And I'm pretty sure there's going to be quite a few landlords doing the same thing and selling.
Housing campaigners have called the legislation a huge opportunity. But with house building targets scrapped and rising interest rates, will it be enough to fix the crumbling foundations of Britain's rental market? Liz Bates, Sky News, North London.
Really feels like housing is going to be such a key battleground, doesn't it, in politics, really impacting so many people. Well, I can speak now to somebody who has experienced firsthand some of the issues in the UK's housing system and has since become one of the country's most prominent housing activists, Kwajo Tweneboa. It's great to have you on the programme. I think it was last year that we last spoke, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And Kwajo is someone who has the ear of government. You always in and out meeting people. Just to introduce yourself to viewers who might not be familiar with yourself and the kind of campaigning you do, why did you end up being drawn into this kind of activism?
Well, I started off, I lived in social housing, and I was living in poor quality social housing with my sisters and my dad, and we were complaining to our landlord at the time, who just simply didn't listen. My dad became ill with cancer, passed away in those conditions, and I had to turn to social media in order to disgrace my landlord, not only my landlord, but other social housing tenants, landlords too, into carrying out necessary works.
And I know you're the sort of person who is always amplifying the voices of other people who are currently living in these conditions, but just describe the conditions that you and your family were living in.
I mean, damp, mould, cockroaches, mice. We had a kitchen that was nearly 100 years old, poor security. We had lights filled with water, you name it. I mean, the list goes on. And since then, I've been contacted by people in social housing, but also the private sector too, living in slum conditions in a lot of cases whilst paying extortionate rents. I mean, we know around 3.2 million people have said in the private sector they have lived at some point in disrepair.
I think it's really important to talk to people like yourself, actually, because I do think that there is a tendency in the Westminster bubble, whether it's journalists, politicians, you name it, for people to reflect on their own experiences, right? And actually, that's not always the norm and what people are actually experiencing, as you say, like across the country. What do you make of what the government's doing today? Do you think it's going to help?
I definitely think it's going to help. I mean, it's a long time coming. People have been asking and begging for changes in regulation, the Renters Reform Bill for the private sector for a very, very long time. So it's very welcomed, especially with the ban on no-fault evictions. That's something people have campaigned on for so long, and just the idea of tenants being evicted with no reason in a lot of cases. I mean, for shelter, for example, there was a 143% increase in no-fault evictions in the last year alone. So that just goes to show how big of a problem it is. And the introduction of an ombudsman service, for example, I mean, with the scrap of no-fault eviction, that doesn't mean that landlords can't still evict tenants. I wanted to make that clear because I think there has been some confusion. What it means is they have to have a valid reason in order to do so. Having said that, with this legislation, I definitely think at the moment there are current loopholes. For example, yes, we're scrapping Section 21, but what we're seeing is landlords can still evict tenants, for example, if they want to move a family member in or if they default on their rental payments. Now, what can happen in this situation with bad landlords? They can then choose to up the rent, for example, make it so unaffordable tenants default and then evict them that way. Or, for example, just say they're going to move a family member in and then the tenants have to move out. So the government definitely needs to tighten up these loopholes to make sure if landlords are evicting tenants, they're for the right reason and they're honest about it.
You made the point as well about funding as well, and say that look, there needs to be funding for enforcement for this to work.
Absolutely. I mean, that's my biggest point. I think it's all good and well having this all written on paper and having this bill discussed in Parliament, but fundamentally what we're relying on in order to regulate this is local authorities. Now, with local authorities, we've seen them underfunded over the last 13 years massively. We've seen the state of social housing run by some local authorities, and now what we're asking is for them to manage 2.2 million landlords too. I think the biggest challenge for Michael Gove now is whether or not he can get the funding to do so. If the Department for Levelling Up doesn't have it, then he has to go to the Chancellor and Prime Minister and convince them that that is the right decision to make.
Just a bit more widely as well, it feels that there's a big debate going on in Westminster about house building and whether or not it should be on the green belt, whether or not local people's concerns should be overridden. What's your take on that?
From what I've seen as a campaigner over the last 2 years and the conditions people are having to live in, the rates of homelessness, people in temporary accommodation, I understand people's concerns, especially about the green belt, but simply we have a crisis here and a crisis that has existed for decades. We need more homes. If that means, unfortunately, that we have to build on pockets in the green belt, then I absolutely think we need to, because what is the other alternative? We need more homes fundamentally.
And then just a bit more widely as well on the cost of living. It always shocks me when I look at rental inflation, right? And also the percentage of people's pay packets that they end up spending on rent. What is going on in the private rented sector, do you think?
People are really, really struggling. I mean, I've spoken to tenants that have to borrow off their kids because they simply cannot afford on their wages to pay for their rent bills, fuel bills and everything else on top of that. We've seen how much food, for example, has gone up. And they are really, really struggling at the moment. I think what is kind of ironic for me is the fact that government is talking about home ownership and pushing home ownership whilst we're in a cost of living crisis and people are struggling to pay their rents. And rents, especially in London, are currently unaffordable for so many. In terms of one bedroom, for example, £1,000 per month is their average. If people can't afford to save, how does the government expect them to get on the ladder? And especially during a cost of living crisis too, when people are struggling. That's the issue you need to, or they need to be dealing with, is bottom-up approach, not top-down.
What do you make of Labour's sort of policies on it? Do you have optimism, I guess? Or...
Yes, I mean, it's really, really interesting, I think, from both parties to see them talking about housing. For a long time, I don't think it's been discussed enough. I think housing is becoming very, very prominent and will be huge at the next general election. Whether or not they are going to make the right decisions and focus on the things that people are calling for most is still up for debate, I think. But I really, really hope they do listen to the people. If they're going to create well-informed policies, they need to be informed by people affected currently by the current situations.
It's always really interesting to talk to you. Thanks very much for taking the time out this evening. Thank you. Really interesting stuff. You're watching The Take. I could definitely agree that I think housing is going to be a key issue at the next election. Next up, we are going to be rounding up everything that we've heard so far and do a bit of post-match analysis with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Cates.
you feeling?
Strong.
One almighty crush.
It was like night fell.
Can you hear that, Mark?
The game is up. He's going to have to stand down.
Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has died.
Against the dollar, ever.
I am resigning.
Hopes of reaching Britain dashed, at least for today.
Hello, welcome back live to Westminster. You're watching The Take. Well, we've had lots of takes this evening. Let's have a bit of the take from Sam Coates, shall we, our Deputy Political Editor, who's here again. We were just discussing, weren't we, how refreshing it is to hear from people like Kwajo, who really are passionate about things like housing reform and are keen to try and make change.
That's right. And we are effectively now in really the very, very early start of the run-up to a general election. And so putting in those bids for change, working through the argument, making your promises is kind of the name of the game at the moment. And we were just sort of stepping back earlier in the office and just having a look at just how much change there might be very imminently. Now, here in the UK, we're expecting a general election next year. We don't know whether it's going to be May, whether it's going to be July, whether it's going to be October or even later in the year. But that could be massive, and it could see the UK install, potentially, if the results are anything like the local elections, the first non-Conservative Prime Minister in 14 years.
14 years, that's huge.
Which is huge. But then pull the camera out and look all around the world. It turns out, Sophie, that next year is the year of elections. They're everywhere. So in November, there'll be a US election, quite possibly Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. Could it be Donald Trump back in the White House, or will it be this guy? Will he be able to stop Donald Trump returning? And it'll be the biggest revenge second act that you have ever seen. Then, in addition, there's Europe. Now, there are European parliamentary elections in June. Now, they're important for us, actually, because off the back of that, you get to choose a new European Commission. They will determine the kind of Brexit deal that we have when the next Prime Minister, or Rishi Sunak, comes into Downing Street and determines exactly how we interact with the European Union. There is even an Indian set of elections next year at some point for one of the most populous countries in the world. Altogether, next year, I calculated that 1.4 billion people are going to go to the polls over the course of that year. We could end up with a very different world at the end of 2024 than the one that we begin with.
That's hugely I can't actually really get my head around what that means, the number of people who are going to be voting. I mean, and
it's a lot of hours in the studio.
That is. And it also does really mean, doesn't it, as you say, that it's quite an unpredictable period. When you have all of that change across the world, it's quite difficult to work out the small changes that can suddenly spark something that actually is a fundamental
Is the world going to return to the sort of centre ground politics, maybe of the late 1990s, early 2000s? Is the world going to move to extremes, more populist solutions? Or are there going to be no patterns at all? That's going to be the exciting question for 2024. It's a bit early for people to start thinking about it. Places like this, we've got to start thinking about it because the change involved is massive.
And some of those elections are quite unpredictable as well. We don't even know who's going to be running in all of them. Sam, thanks very much indeed, as always, for your analysis. That's it for The Take. We'll be back next week and every week on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Next up, it is Sky News at 10. Thanks very much for watching.